Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to chat about Chapter 2, which is Communication, Culture, and Work. So in this chapter, you'll see how culture and various communication practices can really influence that workplace professional environment and how we choose to interact within those situations. So first of all, what we're going to start with in this lecture is the nature of culture. And our text points out that culture is learned, it's not innate. So culture is not something that we are born with. It's not something that we just have in us. It's something that we learn through our environment and the various situations that we're in. Culture also shapes our worldview. So for instance, if you chat with someone that has only lived in small town USA versus someone that's a very renowned world traveler, there's going to be a difference in how that person communicates and views the world, right? Not necessarily one is better than the other, but there is going to be some communication differences and probably shifts in how we view certain situations or our stance on certain things, right? Culture is also invisible to those accustomed to the particular culture, and then also very visible to people that are not accustomed to a culture. So for instance, we don't even notice really as Americans, especially in our specific region, any cultural differences. It's not even a thought process, right? If we meet someone outside of our culture, we might notice those differences right away. So for instance, accents. I love listening to people talk that are from a different part of the US or a different part of the world. And I often ask them to say things again if I thought it was really interesting or really pretty to my ears, right? So that's just one example. Accent is a very obvious one, right? But we're always going to notice those other things when it's something that we're not accustomed to, something that is new to us, right? So each person's communication style is a combination of individual and cultural traits. So we talk probably like our family members, right? We communicate like our region, we communicate like our country, right? And that's a combination, again, of who we are and the culture that we're in, our environment, right? Okay, and we need to know, guys, the book definition of culture. So this is what we're going to go by in terms of the term culture. So culture is a learned set of shared interpretations about beliefs, values, and norms that affect the behaviors of a relatively large group of people. So later in this lecture, we'll get into co-cultures, but knowing that culture is kind of sectioning off groups of people and how that group of people sees the world, their worldview, right? And this can be about beliefs, values, and norms. So beliefs, going back to something like we believed a long time ago that the world was flat, right? And through science we learned, nope, we actually believe now that the world is a sphere. We can see that in telescopes, etc. Science has proven that the world is not flat, right? Values are something like what we know to be right or wrong, true, false, all those good things, right? Norms, guys, I think norms might even be the most obvious for us to point out. So norms are something like we chew with our mouth closed, right? Or we don't eat with our fingers. Manners, something that we view as acceptable that may not be acceptable in other countries. Eye contact might be another. How you treat men and women, superiors, inferiors, all those kinds of things. And we'll get into those details a little more heavily. But if you think about these norms, and if you were to break the norm in how it is accepted in society, it would be very odd. So if you were disruptive in a restaurant, people would be kind of looking sideways at you, right? If you got in the elevator and you were facing the wrong way and standing towards the wall, what would people think? So all those examples, if you were to do something kind of out of the norm. Another thing would be when someone asks you, how are you today? What's our typical response? We say, oh, I'm fine, right? Well, if we actually were to say exactly what was on our mind and whether we were really good or maybe not so good and explain that, what would the other person do? they would think, wow, that's way more information than what I was going for, but thanks for sharing, something along those lines, right? We just expect that quick, I'm fine. It's just a formality that we start with, even if we don't necessarily really want to know exactly how you're doing, right? So norms, values, and beliefs shape culture. All right, so if we think about cultural diversity and communication on a global level, right? So we have a lot of changing demographics in our world at this point in time, and it's going to get more and more diverse as time goes on. We have increased multinational companies. So companies are kind of going all over the world, right? They have reach everywhere. And global talent is prioritized. So those types of people that kind of pop around and recognize communication and cultural differences and work in various atmospheres and get along in various cultures, fit in, is becoming more and more prevalent in the business world as things become more and more global and demographics become more and more diverse. All right, guys, so now we'll talk about some differences with culture in terms of the business setting. And what I'm going to do here is pull up a website, and this is from Property Turkey. And we're going to talk about some 12 Turkish rules you might not know. And I know you can't see all of this on your page, but we'll get the gist of things. So the first says smiling doesn't mean rudeness. So Turks smile much less than Westerners, and this doesn't necessarily mean they are unfriendly or unwelcoming, but it just goes to show that different cultures regard even nonverbals very differently. This says don't put your handbag on the floor. It's considered bad luck and unsanitary. In Turkey, they treat bread with respect. So in many cultures, bread represents prosperity, the ability to feed yourself and one's family. And this picture is the owner of a bakery in Turkey put bread out of his bakery and put a sign saying, if you are needy, take for free. Warm greetings are the order of the day, so many Turks see handshakes as a little uptight, and they would rather go in for the half hug. So there's a cultural difference there. We automatically kind of stick our hand out when we meet somebody, right? Most Turks don't believe in the evil eye. Cold is the source of all ills. Just about every illness in Turkey is attributed to cold drafts. Keep your voice down on public transport. So that is very different than American transport, I think. Lemon cologne is everywhere. Offer others a snack or drink before you get your own. Never refuse a cup of tea. Turks love to touch. And what's the hurry? Turks are generous with their time. And we'll get to talking about time here a little bit later in the lecture. So guys, those are just a few examples of some differences with customs and behavior. Now we'll chat a little bit more about formality. So formality can even tie to some of these other things, such as greetings, gift giving, business cards, socialization. So formality in the Japanese culture, you bow to one another when you greet, and the person that bows the lowest is considered lower on the hierarchy than the other person that they are greeting. Greetings in some countries, you do the like kiss on either cheek, which is a little bit awkward if you're an American and are not familiar with that. So it's just a matter of adapting to that culture and recognizing the differences there. Here's another website, this is from Business Insider, that gives a story about business cards in Japan. So I'll just read a little bit of this to you. It says, 10 days ago I traveled to Tokyo to help Business Insider launch its international edition. He had a day of packed press conferences and parties to celebrate the website's launch. And then here's where we get into the business cards. It says, unsurprisingly, I was asked to meet lots of important Japanese business people, journalists, and advertisers. Each interaction went something like this. Someone introduces us, we bow, exchange names, and if the Japanese person offers, we shake hands. So those are all those cultural norms, right, that he's just kind of going with. The Japanese person takes out a meticulously crafted business card and holds it out with both hands. I take the card, study it with interest, and then begin to apologize. I have no business card to give them. I take out a pen and paper and begin to furiously scribble down my phone number, email address, name, and company position. This interaction has played out again and again throughout my time in Japan, and although I apologize, I am undoubtedly committing a major Japanese faux pas. Japan, at its core, a country of rituals, respect, and etiquette. Whenever Japanese people meet for the first time, particularly in a business setting, they present business cards, and I'm not even going to try and say what the custom is known as. So while exchanging business cards isn't unusual in the US, no relationship will be jeopardized if you fail to bring one. Smartphones have all made business cards obsolete for millennials, have all but made business cards obsolete for millennials. Hence why I failed to bring them. I had business cards printed once when I was looking for a job after graduating college. In the intervening years, I've defaulted to directing new contacts to my LinkedIn or Facebook profiles. No one is ever offended. That's in the US at least. In Japan, it is quite the opposite. So the custom is considered to be a formal introduction to the person. No business can begin until cards are exchanged because the exchange itself indicates the beginning of a relationship. The rules of the exchange are of equal importance. If you don't want to offend your new acquaintance, you will. The highest ranking person gives out the business card first. Cards must be given and received with two hands, and cards should be handed face down to the receiver. Cards should be kept on display for the remainder of the interaction, and cards should be kept as immaculately as possible. And it says these last two are the most important. Business cards are considered an extension of the person you are meeting. Going along here, it says poorly kept cards indicate either a poorly kept person or a lack of respect to the person you are presenting the card to. Even worse, if you shove the newly received card into a pocket or handle it roughly, it also indicates a lack of respect. So that's just one example from one country in terms of business cards. So you can see there's a lot of cultural differences that we have to be knowledgeable about and accommodate for. So I strongly encourage you, if you're going to travel, to do research on the country you're going to, so that those kinds of things don't happen to you and you can communicate as effectively as possible. Another social custom I want to touch on is gift giving. So in some cultures, gifts are expected. So if you're going to someone's house for dinner, I don't know that it's expected in the US, but it's polite. If you ask if you can bring a dish, if you bring a dish, if you bring a bottle of wine, those kinds of things. In other cultures, if you are invited out, if you are going from one country to another country or coming back home, it might be customary that you bring a gift from that other culture to show your appreciation, or give a gift from your culture to the culture you're visiting to show your appreciation for their hospitality, for instance. Lastly, guys, socializing. So is it acceptable for the business setting, the professional setting, for you to go out with colleagues after work, or is that kind of frowned upon? Is that a networking tool, or is it something you should shy away from? There's other things like, is dating your coworkers okay in certain countries, in certain work cultures? Is it not okay? Kind of how does that hierarchy work? Is it accepted? Is it not accepted? Is it just with coworkers? Can you go out with people above you? Those kinds of things. So just always acknowledging, kind of feeling out that culture and how you should interact in those situations and with people of those other cultures. So just kind of acknowledging where they come from and how they're used to doing things. Alright, so guys, we're going to continue on with these differences and talking about styles of dress, time, tolerance for conflict, and gender roles. So for style of dress, guys, I'm going to reference another website. It's called Mind Tools, and their tagline is Essential Skills for an Excellent Career. And here they talk about avoiding cultural faux pas in your travels. So dressing to impress, not offend while abroad. And here I think this statement is very applicable. Every culture has norms when it comes to what people should wear at work. Recognizing them can mean the difference between success and failure, both personally and professionally. And then it goes on to say, as the saying goes, we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but we often do when it comes to clothing. In fact, many people will develop a strong first impression about your professionalism, business acumen, and even your intelligence based on what you wear. So then this article goes through the dress etiquette of the world, and here it talks about formal business wear. Conservative business wear remains the norm in many countries such as Argentina, Egypt, and Brazil, where suits are typically worn by men and women, although in some places women tend to wear skirts rather than pantsuits. In Italy and Spain, the taste of your formal wear can create a strong impression. And if you dress too casually in certain cultures, your host may think you are impolite. So their tip here is the best way to decide what to wear is to dress similarly to your coworkers in the country. If you have any questions, it's always best to ask politely than to choose unwisely and regret it later. And then this website continues to talk about business casual, hot climates. The thing I think is really important to point out here is skin exposure. So the amount of skin that women show is a contentious issue in some cultures. So if in doubt, err on the side of caution. For example, in India, Morocco, and China, women should avoid tight-fitting clothes, and they should make sure that skirts cover their knees and that their necklines are high. In Saudi Arabia, women should only show skin on their face, hands, and feet. All women, foreign and local, must also wear a black cloak called an abaya, I think, and a headscarf in public. So that's just one example that kind of leads us into gender roles as well in terms of skin exposure. And I'll give you another example, guys. I traveled abroad quite a bit in college, and even when I went to specifically a lot of places in Rome and the Vatican, etc., it was very important, even visiting churches around the world. It was almost required, like if you were with a tour guide or a group leader, that women had full-length dress or pants on so that you couldn't see your ankles and knees, those kinds of things. So that was something that we had to prepare for and know when we were going on tours and such to make sure that we were appropriate for that setting. Alright guys, so before we wrap up this slide talking about tolerance for conflict and gender roles, we'll touch on time here. And there's two basic time clocks, I guess you could say, or how people reference time. And in some countries, people reference time monochronically, and in others, it's polychronic. So monochronic is based on a timeline, and this is largely what the U.S. focuses on, right? So if you know that your class starts at 8:10, you expect to get out at 9:40, and you expect your class to start promptly at 8:10 and to leave promptly at 9:40. If your professor is going over even a minute or two, what is everybody doing? Packing up their stuff, looking at their watch, waiting to go, kind of annoyed that your professor is keeping you, right? So we are largely monochronic time. We're very focused on saving time, whether or not we're wasting time. We're very, very highly sensitive to time, and we're very focused on staying within time limits, right? Polychronic time, on the other hand, is more flexible and fluid. Things get done when they get done, and your social life and your personal life are kind of just meshed. So you just roll along, and there's no real sense of time, really. It's just kind of when things get done and the next sequence of events in your day, right? So if you've ever heard the expression, we're on island time, like where there's no set in stone time when things have to be done, it's more relaxed, right? Whereas in the US, our time is money, time is very valuable, right? So differences between monochronic and polychronic time can be a little bit harder. Some people don't have a sense, or some cultures don't have a sense of being late or going over time, right? And that can be hard if you're in business meetings and you expect to be done by a certain time, or you expect to start at a certain time. So always being accommodating and tolerant of differences, especially with time. Okay, so now we'll touch on tolerances for conflict. And guys, I really love this section in the text on page 45. It says, in a meeting, Americans can argue, hit the table, and leave as if nothing happened, while a Mexican might not forgive you for 3 months. I have to make sure not to personalize things sometimes. So that's a great example of the differences between culture in terms of conflict. So some cultures are very aggressive and just want to tackle the problem head on. And other cultures really want to save face, and it's very important to keep the harmony. So just knowing what kind of culture you're in, and either being a little bit more aggressive if you're from kind of a harmonized type of culture, or reining it in if you're from a more aggressive culture, and kind of coming up with a way to keep the peace is going to be very important. I'll also touch on gender roles here a little bit. It's just very important to understand kind of the hierarchy in various countries in terms of men and women. So even if a woman technically outranks a man in, say, an American culture or an American business, going to do business meetings overseas, that culture might divert to the man just because he is male. And I think as an American woman, if I were to go to some other countries where women are less respected or less regarded as a man, I think those kinds of communication practices might shock us. But again, we just have to realize that there are differences, and try and accommodate and be tolerant of those differences with culture and gender roles. So always just keeping in mind that there are very different cultural styles in business, and we need to do our research and do our best to accommodate. Okay, so moving on to some other dimensions of cultural diversity, I'll talk briefly about the difference between high context and low context cultures. So in high context cultures, meaning is conveyed subtly, and that's to save face and to keep that social harmony. So for instance, you might not or hardly ever hear people say distinct no, right? They're always trying to save face about the person possibly making a request and their own face, trying, again, just working towards that social harmony, not wanting to make anybody uncomfortable or feel badly. In contrast, we have a low context where meaning conveyed by the spoken word. So you say what you mean and you mean what you say. So you distinctly say yes or no, distinctly outline your plan, distinctly outline direction, and more concerned with getting the job done, and again, just meaning what you say right off the cuff. So difference there: high context, saving face, kind of keeping the peace, even keel; low context, meaning conveyed by spoken words. All right, now we'll go on to the difference between individualism and collectivism. And I'm going to give you this example. If you were to go to work one day and your boss said, you know, you've been doing a great job, and I really feel like you've earned a $10,000 bonus. If you were in an individualistic culture like the US, what would you do with that $10,000? Would you buy a car? Would you maybe take a trip that you've always planned on taking? Would you maybe pay off some student debt or other loans that you've accumulated? Basically, all of the options that would immediately run through your head there would be something that you could spend the money on for yourself individually, right? And then if we looked at a collectivistic culture, our book uses this example with collectivism, and it says that one person received a bonus in a collectivistic culture, and with that money they decided to equally spread that $10,000 with their coworkers, because they realized that the job at hand and doing a job well done was a group effort. So everybody should receive the same contributions for their efforts, the same reward for their efforts, right? So difference between individualistic cultures very concerned with ourselves, collectivistic cultures very concerned with the group, culture, family, social network at large, right? All right, guys, now we'll talk about power distance, and then we'll get into some uncertainty avoidance. Okay, so here it's very important to understand the differences between high and low power distance. And power distance is basically the differences in the attitudes toward authority. So with a high power distance, that's where those in the workplace have to recognize, respect, and kind of honor that status or the various levels of people within a company. whereas in a low power distance setting, it's more of an even keel where people feel okay with challenging authority, offering new ideas, those kinds of things. So in those challenges, in the low context cultures, you're kind of challenging authority and working your way up toward authority versus that high context culture where the ranks are just set and you're very comfortable and set in that role. It's very routine for you. Okay, so now we'll talk about uncertainty avoidance. And this is basically, are you comfortable or uncomfortable with uncertainty? And which culture respects uncertainty and is open to uncertainty and which is not. And your text gives the example of some cultures such as Singapore and Hong Kong are comfortable with uncertainty, allowing their members to take risks and being relatively tolerant of behavior that differs from the norm. Other cultures such as Japan, Greece, and Portugal are less comfortable with change. Their members value tradition and formal rules and show less tolerance for different ideas. So you can see the difference there between uncertainty avoidance. Are you willing to take some risks, open to new ideas, or are you more of a historical setting where you really value tradition and the formal rules of your culture? Very interesting stuff to think about. Alright guys, moving right along, we'll talk about task orientation versus social orientation, followed by short-term orientation versus long-term orientation. Okay, so our book talks about task versus social orientation in terms of masculinity and femininity. And that's not necessarily a gender reference, it's just kind of how it's referred to and talked about in terms of orientation. So task orientation, you're really concerned with just getting the job done. And in social orientation, you're more concerned with people's feelings and the atmosphere of the interaction, right? So here's a picture of a wedding below. And we know that there's a lot that goes into preparing and planning for a wedding, right? And sometimes we focus so much on the task at hand that we forget the social aspect until you actually get to the event and you're interacting with people, right? So thinking about, and there's even certain personalities that are more likely to be task-oriented or more likely to be social-oriented, and knowing that we kind of need both, but there's going to be some cultures that are much more task-oriented at large and some that are much more social-oriented at large. And you can kind of see where those would tie in with possibly monochronic time or polychronic time, whether you're very set on a strict schedule, task-oriented, or where you're polychronic and your time is just kind of, it gets done when it gets done, and you're bringing in your personal life with your work life, etc. So again, task orientation, masculine, you're very set on getting the job done. Social orientation, you're more concerned with emotion, feelings, and that social interaction. Then we'll talk about short-term orientation versus long-term orientation. And long-term orientation is just kind of as it says. You're shooting for long-range goals. You're working towards those long-range goals. And short-term orientation, you're looking for quick payoffs. And our text says, the willingness to work hard today for a future payoff is especially common in East Asian cultures, while Western industrialized cultures are much more focused on short-term goals. So interesting to think about how you structure your work life. I always wonder if long-term oriented cultures have more longevity in specific jobs, and short-term cultures, we seem to job hop a lot more. So very interesting to think about, especially in terms of how that relates to time and different task and social orientations. Alright guys, so next we'll talk about co-cultural dimensions of a diverse society, starting with language. Okay, so in talking about co-cultures, our text defines a co-culture as groups that have a clear identity within the majority of the culture. So when we think about language, if we know a group of people that are able to speak a different language or are bilingual, we can recognize them as a co-culture, right? They have identity through their language, and they are a group within a majority culture. Other examples are regional differences. So maybe in the big city, you might avoid making eye contact with people, avoid smiling at people on the street, whereas in a small town, you can just wave away, shout out the window to the people you know on the street. So again, differences in co-cultures within a larger region, within a larger country, in terms of your region and your language. Also thinking about ethnicity, guys. Does one ethnicity prefer lots of talk, lots of communication and conversation, or do they prefer a more silent nature? Does one dive into conflict, or does one avoid conflict, and how will you manage that? In terms of communication, does one appreciate a lot of disclosure, or does one appreciate a lot of privacy? Nonverbal standards are another element of ethnicity as well that we also need to always be aware of. Another co-culture is social class, and there's kind of a hierarchy within social class that can be co-cultures in and of themselves. And guys, then we have generational differences as well, and our text talks about the difference between baby boomers, Generation Xers, and millennials. And you can clearly see kind of differences there in how people speak, even the language that they use based on your generation and your age, whether or not you're tech savvy, all those kinds of things. So read over that page, that's page 36 in your text, going on to page 37 about generational differences there. Okay, now we'll talk about disabilities, guys. And disabilities is kind of a hard one to juggle in terms of communication. And I want to point out that anyone can join this co-culture at any moment. So we always want to be respectful and do our best to accommodate the person and keep the situation so that no one feels uncomfortable, right? And here's a few tips for disability etiquette that the University of Wyoming put out in a handout. And first of all, it says ask before you help. So sometimes people with disabilities are fine on their own. They can navigate on their own. And just jumping in to offer help can almost be too invasive. Think before you speak. So do the best that you can to not offend the person that has a disability. And guys, we want to use person first language. I'm going to skip down there in terms of thinking before you speak with disability. In person first language, this is using affirmative phrases such as person with disability or person who is blind. So we want to use those affirmative phrases here rather than saying the disabled or the blind. And guys, that's on page 38 of your text. So be sure to really read over those details so you know how to act in these kinds of situations. You want to avoid making assumptions. You want to extend the same courtesy that you would to a person without a disability to a person with a disability, such as still offering to shake the person's hand. I'm sure that that person with disability will have some kind of reaction that they're used to in those social settings, in that culture and that environment that they know to be true. You want to treat the people with disability as adults and relax. They're likely used to other people not necessarily knowing how to communicate or respond. So if you're saying something like see you later to a person with a disability that might be blind, or those kinds of phrases that we're just used to saying, relax, be confident, don't worry about those things too much. And again, always using person first language with people that are disabled. Okay, moving right along into ethical issues for Chapter 2. So in thinking about diversity and ethical issues, especially when communicating and doing business cross-culturally, you might run into some challenges that just make you feel a little bit uncomfy or don't really fit into how you view things or how you've grown up viewing things as right or wrong, okay, not okay in the workplace. So here's some ways that we can respond to challenges. So I'll give you an example. Maybe you're doing business overseas and it's customary doing business to offer bribes to your clients. So that might make you uncomfy. It's not typically how you do things. You're not sure if it's okay. So one way you could handle it is you could avoid. You could just refuse to do business with that client. The other thing you could do is accommodate by acknowledging that things might be done a little bit differently in this different culture. or you could force and just say that the client has to do things your way and revert back to what you are comfortable in your culture. We can also revert to educating here. And this is where you try and convince people with whom you want to do business that your set of ethical principles is more appropriate. So rather than just forcing your culture and your way of life on the person, you kind of go about it in a more harmonizing way by trying to educate and persuade that way. You might go to negotiation and compromising, which is where you and the other party could do a little bit of a give and take, give each other something to negotiate a settlement. And so that might be like lowering the bribe or just coming to some sort of compromise there where both the client and the businessman are happy in that situation and willing to kind of budge and move that much each other. Then collaboration problem solving, you could work with the other party to confront the conflict directly and develop a mutually satisfying solution. So in negotiating compromise, you're giving up something. One person is giving up something, the other person is giving up something, and you're coming to a compromise. Could be one or the other that's giving up something. And then in collaboration, you're kind of really working where both people are happy and nothing's being lost in that argument, or that challenge per se. All right, we'll continue with diversity and talking about communicating across diversity, starting with becoming culturally literate. So ending our lecture here, we'll talk about communicating across diversity. And I think all of these things tie together in a nice kind of wrap-up conversation for us with Chapter 2. So we need to become culturally literate. And what that means is we need to take the time and effort to study up on a culture and be knowledgeable about a culture before we become ingrained in the culture. And we need to do our best to assimilate as best we can to make that process pretty seamless. And try not to stick out as much, I would say. So we're trying to assimilate, we're trying to avoid being ethnocentric, where we put ourselves and our culture above another, right? Each culture is unique and has something really cool and different to offer the world. So we need to see and view diversity as an opportunity rather than something that's a little bit annoying or that we're forced into and have to work around, right? So I challenge you to create this dialogue and just chat with people of different cultures, and that'll really help with becoming culturally literate and becoming excited about the opportunity to work in a growing global business network and professional network. And then lastly, guys, we always need to be conscious that we're not condescending to another culture, and that really ties to ethnocentrism again, where we're not putting ourselves above another or looking down on another culture. Again, doing our best to assimilate and find common ground, seeing diversity as an opportunity. Last but not least here, guys, organizational culture and career planning. You want to learn about a company's culture and obviously the country's culture of that company, right? So you can create that dialogue. You can start by studying the physical setting. You can read about the company. You can observe communication practices, interview company people, learn how people spend their time within the company, socializing, really ingrain yourself in that culture and that company's culture. And together you should be able to assimilate well. Okay, that is it for Chapter 2. Please take your Chapter 2 quiz and email me with any questions. Thanks, guys.